We have Walter Katz from Arnold Ventures. Prior to that, Walter spent 17 years as a public defender here in Southern California. He also was an auditor, police auditor, and worked in the Inspector General's office in San Jose and Los Angeles County, respectively. And then he went to work for Rahm Emanuel in the Chicago mayor's office, where he worked with the police there to create a use of force policy before joining Arnold. We also have Carroll Bogert. Carroll is the executive director of the Marshall Project, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. It has won 2 Pulitzers for its criminal justice coverage. Prior to that, she was deputy director at the Human Rights Watch for 18 years. Prior to that, she was a foreign correspondent for Newsweek, where she worked in Moscow, Beijing, Hong Kong, and covered, just little stories like the fall of the Soviet Union or Tiananmen Square. So they are here to speak with us tonight about criminal justice, obviously, but particularly about the trends that we're seeing. So we hear a lot and talk a lot in the public, in the media, about crime news, crime coverage. It's been a major factor for the past many election cycles, 2022 being no exception, and I'm sure 2024 won't either. But our job is to put that into context, and that is also what Walter is going to do for us tonight. And Carroll is going to talk about the media's side of that, where we go right and where we go wrong. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our first speakers.
Good afternoon, or for those on the East Coast like me, good evening. It is 8 o'clock in New York, where I'm from, so I would have just had dinner. I'm feeling very sleepy, and I got to now perform, and I'm okay. So today, first of all, I'm going to thank the National Press Foundation for inviting me back to have this conversation with you today. I first interacted with this amazing organization back in 2020 during the last cohort of print media fellows, and that was such a satisfying experience to have this conversation with them about perceptions of crime and perceptions of police legitimacy. This was November of 2020, just a few months after the murder of George Floyd and the unrest that took place across the country. And these were a lot of, in some ways, early to early mid-career reporters. I follow all of them on Twitter, to the extent I'm still on Twitter. And they've done amazing work since then. And so being able to come back and speak to all of you here in La Jolla is really amazing. And I flew into LAX earlier today and drove down, and a couple of thoughts were on my mind. The first is the thought of coming back to San Diego County, where I began my career as a public defender back in the 1990s. Spent my first 2.5 years here as a public defender before going to LA County, and just thinking how I felt kind of full circle. Here I went from a little misdemeanor public defender handling DUIs of Marines up here at Camp Pendleton, and now I'm being asked to talk to station news directors. The other thing I thought about is how I've now lived over the last 8 or so years in Los Angeles, up in the Silicon Valley, in Chicago, where I was Mayor Emanuel's Deputy Chief of Staff for Public Safety, and now in New York, where I'm at Arnold Ventures. And what I've noticed is how every place I've been in has a different flavor of how it approaches news, and especially how it approaches crime coverage. For example, I'm not here to criticize today, but just observations. For example, I think there is a reason that Los Angeles has so many police pursuits. And I think the very reason that Los Angeles has so many police pursuits is because somebody at 5 o'clock can engage in a pursuit and can guarantee that he's going to be on live news coverage. Whereas in Chicago, for example, there is no helicopter news coverage of police pursuits. So you don't see what happens, you don't see the outcomes, but there tend to be fewer of them. Doesn't mean causation, it's just a correlation I've observed. So I've been lucky from having seen this country from a lot of different geographic perceptions and from professional perspectives and hope to share some of those thoughts with you today. Really how I'm thinking about my remarks this evening is asking the question, is perception of crime reality, and how does news media help to shape that perception? And my own personal experience to take away from it is when I was in the Chicago mayor's office, I was at a community event on the north side, speaking to a neighborhood. I think for those who are from Chicago know somebody's here from WTTW, hello. I think we're somewhere around the 19th district up near Lincoln Park, really safe neighborhood. But residents were concerned about car break-ins, and this is back in about 2017 or so, 2018. And I made the mistake, which I'll never ever do again, is to try to tell the audience of residents that actually, wrong word, the data shows that car thefts are down. And they were really angry at me saying that. They say, how can you tell me that we know what's actually going on? Okay, I may have been completely wrong, right? Maybe they've gotten so cynical they've stopped reporting crimes, so the data's not showing it. Or maybe their perception is, because now they're using WhatsApp and Nextdoor and other sorts of social media, that perception of crime is being amplified. And so I want to give that example from my perspective in a mayor's office, knowing what the pressures are from the political perspective, and knowing what the pressures are for news stations where you have competitors, you have commercial challenges, you have time pressure, you don't have a lot of time to put out a story, and often you don't have time to follow up on a story. Unfortunately, the cost is that there's a ton of context in criminal justice which is getting lost, in my opinion, as a result of that need for urgency, and as the result that people like me, who were in mayor's offices, spent a lot of energy on shaping what we thought the message should be around public safety. And maybe my being up here today is part of my penance for that. So let's talk a little bit about my view of crime trends. Current crime trends, and I want to start there because in many ways the broader context should go all the way back to 2019. 2019 in many places, if you look at the national data, in terms of, I'm really going to focus here on homicides and aggravated assaults. In other words, a shooting that did not lead to a murder for the most part. By 2019, there have been record decreases in crime. The long-term trend by 2019, going back almost 20 years, showed a continued and consistent downward trend in crime in general, and particularly in violent crime. And then, of course, 2020 happened. It shifted so much of what we understood about our society, what we understood about our families and ourselves. And unfortunately, one of the reflections was an increase a rapid increase in violent crime. At the same time, there's a significant decrease in property crime. Now, one thing I'll not tell you is why there was a rapid increase in violent crime. But we do know that homicides increased over 2019 to 2020 by about 29%, the largest year-over-year increase that had ever occurred in the history of data collection on homicides. We know that in 2021, the increase was still occurring, but was slowing down, that from 2021 compared to 2020, the increase in homicides was about 5%. And if we looked at the first 6 months of data from 2020, really dependent where you were looking. First 6 months, there's still a slight uptick in homicides, but it was really slowing down. I think once we see the full year data for 2022, we'll generally see an overall decrease in homicides with exceptions, right? There's some jurisdictions, Portland, for example, had a record number of homicides last year. Houston just reported its crime data today, front page news of the Chronicle, showed an overall decrease in crime. So there's some variation, as always, across the country. But that general trend of a spike, hopefully no one's calling it a blip or anything else people are calling it was real. More people are dying. We had about almost 22,000 homicides in 2020. It was an awful year. against the context of several things occurring, right? Record sales of guns. So now I believe there are about 1.2 guns for every American citizen. I have the data right, but only about 40% of the population owns a gun. So that means there's a lot of people who have lots of guns and a big chunk of people have no guns. But we also had a pandemic. We also had the unrest. And all these things were not difficult to understand because in some ways they were these black swan events. No one was expecting of a pandemic which shut down our economy and shut down our society for months at a time. Because of that very nature, in my view, that the society was shut down, when George Floyd's murder occurred, it created the perfect storm. High visibility, social media shared it very quickly so that it went viral, and it was an obvious moral failure, right? The morality of what occurred on the street on May 25th of 2020 was extraordinarily obvious to see and to understand. See, maybe not understand, right? Now, the challenge is, all those things occurred, and when one looks at the crime data, one says, I see this giant spike in 2020 that must have happened because of, okay, well, now you can have some options here. Option number one, is it because police officers felt the society didn't have their back anymore, so they stopped doing police work? Is it because the crash in legitimacy meant people were no longer respecting the law and so taking law into their own hands? Is it because police officers engaged in a cynical work slowdown and stopped doing police work to treat everybody, teach everyone a lesson? I'm not giving you any of those answers. I don't know. The problem, though, is when we look at the latter half of 2020 into 2021, everyone had an answer. And in my view, most answers are already based on the biases of the person who is trying to provide the answer for you. So I have a great deal of empathy for you that being able to divide, to basically split hairs, which you don't have a lot of time to do, was almost a requirement to understand what is a person's motivations, what data are they basing it upon, is there any evidence behind the claim that they are making? Now, what causes increases and decreases in violent crime? I think is a difficult answer even for esteemed social scientists to understand. I suggest if you're really interested in this topic to, for example, read Dr. Pat Sharkey's Uneasy Peace, where he talks about that very challenge. And philanthropy, hopefully, we'll be able to announce something soon what we'd like to do about that. But these are really, really difficult things to tease out. So we have this increase in violence. We have economic uncertainty, we have social uncertainty, we have political uncertainty, and we have what may be answers about what is occurring or not. Now, one thing we heard was that the Defund the Police movement was responsible for violence. And I don't know if anybody is here from an ABC owned and operated. If you are, I have to applaud some fabulous reporting that was done last August or September, which examined the budgets of more than 100 cities and counties and found that 83% are spending at least 2% more on police in 2022 than in 2019. Of the 109 budgets analyzed, only 8 agencies cut police funds by more than 2%, while 91 agencies increased law enforcement funding by at least 2%. That's an example of that vitally important context that has to be provided when we as a society are having these conversations about what makes communities safe and what are the factors that help drive unrest and help drive disorder and violent crime. And defund was an easy phrase to say. It was an easy phrase to attack, partially because of its very ambiguity. Some folks who are supporting decreasing police budgets were abolitionists who simply wanted to either do away with policing or significantly shrink it, and others really believed in more of a decrease and replace the funding, that the funding should be, we don't need as much funding for policing, and we can transfer and make more investments in social services which can have better outcomes with fewer social harms. So against that range, of that nuance of what does defund mean, into that came this counter argument saying it is this pernicious, dangerous thing which is causing violence to occur. Of course, it's difficult to say that defunding is causing violence when city council members in a few of the largest cities in the country are talking about it in September and October for that year's budget season, when no budgets have been cut yet, with the exception of a little bit in New York, a tiny bit in Los Angeles, and a couple of other cities which were really energized to make significant cuts. But those were outliers relative to the majority of the country. So I'm not going to go all night, I promise. So current crime trends. Where were we as of 6 months into 2022? I'll be brief. Homicides are now starting to trend downwards, it seemed. Of course, 1 year is not a trend. Gun assaults were now down 6%, while we're seeing an increase in aggravated assaults and robberies and property crime. But remember, let's use property crime as an example. Those are year-to-year comparisons. And I remember how I showed you that in 2019 to 2020, there was a significant fall in property crimes. So that continued into 2021, right? Because we're still in the pandemic, we're still in Omicron. So one would expect property crime to start reverting back to norm because society was returning back to normal patterns of people leaving their home to go to work during the day, cars being broken into, et cetera. So again, I don't want to offer too many explanations, but just some, remember, 1 year is not a trend, and any claim of making a deep analysis over year-to-year data should be taken with somewhat of a grain of salt and understand, well, what was happening the prior year before you're doing that comparison. Perceptions about crime. Surprisingly, in our polarized country, perceptions about crime are driven to a great deal by political affiliation and philosophy. But, and this is a significant but, when we look at people in both major political parties prior to the election, both ranked the problem of safety pretty highly. But what showed were differences in perceptions of where that risk came from. So there are distinctions between people who were more concerned about the role of guns and socioeconomic stability, and others who were more likely to believe it's because there were not enough police officers and because of defunding. Those are very closely aligned with political affiliation and political outlook, but it's important to keep in mind that people from both political parties were concerned. Another thing, though, I really want to point out, though, is that because it's really almost too easy to default back to political affiliation about perceptions about crime, to look for an example at Minneapolis and the failure of the passage of Measure 2, which would have completely reformed the concept of policing Minneapolis and done away with the police department and replaced it with a much lighter touch Department of Public Safety. The voters turned that down. And some people were surprised that one of the areas which voted against it was North Minneapolis, with a significant black population. But polling by the New York Times, for example, as early as June of 2020, was showing that black residents in North Minneapolis still desired a police presence. What we know from the research is that people are comfortable with the police presence, but they want good policing. Now, some may argue, and fairly so, that often people just think about that binary because they don't know about any other option. It's either policing or no policing and nothing else. Not thinking of social services, of the role that they have to play, et cetera. But so we should be very cautious about applying too much of a partisan spin on perceptions about crime, even though they are there, and too much of a racial or ethnic spin to it, even though they are there, particularly when we ask questions about how do you feel about trust and legitimacy in policing, where we see stark and consistent distinctions between how white Americans and black Americans and brown Americans perceive it, perceive police legitimacy and trust. And trust and legitimacy then correlate directly, if you, for example, are familiar with the writings about procedural justice, translate directly into cooperation with the police, the willingness to report crime, and in communities which already struggle with social cohesion, which already struggle with feeling they are not included in the broader society, those can have real negative effects. Let me move on and try to wrap this up. So I already talked about perceptions of crime. You all did a lot of reporting on the response to crime, the federal government's response, both through the American Rescue Plan as well as the Bipartisan Community Safety Act. But I want to put those numbers out there to go to three things that I do think that you should pay attention to. One, I already talked about how to think about crime trends. I've kept a pretty high level, but caution about year-over-year comparisons, caution about claims of causal inference, where something is actually correlation or maybe even a coincidence. Think about how police budgets, which are a reflection of values, how they're being talked about and who's talking about them. There's some folks who, very honestly, in my opinion, when crime goes up, they ask for larger police budgets to bring crime down. And when crime goes down, they ask for larger police budgets to maintain the decrease in crime. So regardless, there is a request for ever larger police budgets. And I think that's a ripe avenue for critical examination with why, what is the return on investment, what are the alternatives, are we getting out of it what we pay for it? And I think in some areas in particular, that question becomes very stark and a matter of life and death. So that's the last thing I want to talk about real briefly before finishing, and that's a thing called clearance rates, or what percentage of reported crimes are resolved by the police, usually with an arrest, and particularly shootings and homicides. The clearance rate for homicides nationally is somewhere around 60%, with great variation from one city to another. So a city like Chicago has a clearance rate of somewhere around 30%. But the important thing is that's the percentage of reported crimes that are cleared by arrest. And the reality is that only about 45% of all type 1 crimes, that means robbery, assaults, theft, homicides, sexual assault, are reported to the police. Only about 45%, and of those, homicide has a high clearance rate of about 60%. When we talk about shootings, for example, aggravated assaults, in some jurisdictions they fall down into the single-digit percentages. So I'd ask you, is my request, to be asking the police department more regularly, how many cases are you actually solving? If the impulse is to do the story of what happened that night at the tape when someone got hurt or killed, there is not a lot of follow-through. But I don't think that city council members or mayors or legislators or the media or the public is asking at all enough questions about how is money being spent and how are you solving these crimes that occur. The last thing, and hopefully I've not taken up too much time, I want to touch on has the same thing to do with clearance rates, because it's about bringing justice to victims of crime. And that is about how victims are treated. I, as a former public defender, had a job to do. There's some instances when I look back at a cross-examination I did where I zealously represented my client at the cost of somebody else who's on the witness stand. But victims have gone through a real experience. I'd encourage you to read a study, was just published, I believe, today, which begins with the title of Like I'm Nobody. And it's a study, a qualitative research study done in Philadelphia of victims of shootings, which had structured interviews with 26 victims of shootings. And this really stood out. The authors say, we consecutively recruited adult firearm injured patients for semi-structured qualitative interviews within 2 months of their injury. Results indicate that participants largely felt, they're asking now about media coverage, largely felt negative or conflicted about making the news and perceived several harms associated with media reports on their injuries, including dehumanization they connected with episodic style reports, reliving trauma when viewing news, distress related to inaccuracies, threats to personal safety when specific details were included, harm to reputation, and negative impacts on public perceptions of safety and community. These findings suggest that firearm-injured people perceive multiple harms associated with episodic narratives that neglect their own viewpoints. These are people who've been victimized by gun violence. Often they're victimized again by negligent or non-caring policing. And then they're victimized again in news coverage, their own perceptions, and they're victimized again when they go through the court system. Victims of violent crime deserve better. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Carroll Bogert. I'm going to hunt around a little bit for my
Should be
PowerPoint.
popping it up for you, I hope.
It'll pop up for me, okay?
It did for me.
First of all, while my PowerPoint is popping up, I just want to say I'm also a journalist. I work for a nonprofit that covers only the criminal justice system, so it's a very different kind of media enterprise than the ones that you represent. But, you know, our industry is going through some really tough times, I don't have to tell you. You know, we've all seen colleagues laid off, you know, budgets are uncertain, audiences getting older or declining. You know, it's not that easy to be in our business. And I really want to thank you for the time that you're spending to be here. For people who work on criminal justice, this may surprise you to know, because of course in our business we're like moany-groany about how little influence we have and how everything sucks. But in fact, you are incredibly important. Criminal justice advocates think and talk all the time about what local broadcasters are doing and feel that there are few elements in American society that are more determinative of what happens in criminal justice policy than what you all put on the air. It's a heavy burden, and I don't mean to make you feel like the pressure's on you, but I just want to say it's really important that you're here. And if you feel sometimes like your job doesn't matter or it isn't what it once was, just remember, you really, really make a difference. If I could title this talk, I would probably have titled it Police Said. I think that's the kind of essential issue at the heart of criminal justice coverage. What the police say, what they tell us, what they don't tell us, what they tell us that is not true, and what other people might tell us, but their voices are, for many different kinds of reasons, not in our picture. So how do we really drill into the problem of police? There are other things in criminal justice coverage that are also very important. The criminal justice system starts before the police with, you know, a school to prison pipeline, and it cycles through a court system and prisons and reentry. There's a lot to cover in criminal justice. But in covering crime, the institution of the police is so overwhelmingly important. How can you do your jobs without information from the police? And what do you do when the police aren't telling you the truth? And how do you break through that obstinacy? And, you know, media and police relations have really changed over time, and I want to talk about that for a minute. Maybe you're wondering why this slide is up there. After the killing of George Floyd in particular, but before that as well, a lot of people began to talk about the origins of policing being in slave patrols. that was where organized groups of men began to pursue criminals, and that policing was somehow really inherently racist because it has its origins in slavery. Now I'm going to figure out how to work this. But I want you to understand something else, that the police and the media are born together. Our profession was born alongside and entwined with the very profession of policing. The very, very old days of newspapers, they were called broadsheets because when you opened them up, they were like 5 feet wide, and they were not meant for the common man. And the penny press, like the New York Herald, comes into being in like the 1830s, 1840s, at the same time that a professional police force is coming into being. They're symbiotic. They're like Siamese twins in the womb. The press need the police to give them great stuff to sell the papers with. And the police need the press because they are making a case for their very existence, that there needs to be a professional police force to deal with crime. So that's really the origins of our industry. This is an extreme example of the kind of florid prose that newspapers use to describe the horrors of crime stalking our city, et cetera. Before there were police, there were like constabulary, and then eventually, of course, if you can call this a real police force, this is what it looked like in the olden days. So I think we have to recognize that our business is really intertwined and in some ways codependent with the institution of the police, and it always has been that way. I think it's necessary to note that the media played such an extremely problematic role in lynchings in America. The record that we have of lynchings in this country is largely a media record. By definition, there are no court records of lynchings. We have press records, and the role that a lot of newspapers played in fomenting lynching really can't be denied. It's also true that the black press at the time was writing a very different kind of narrative about lynching, so of course media is a diverse industry and can't be portrayed with a single brush. This is an incident from the 1970s when Hugh Carey, the governor of New York, was in a super tight race for re-election. Juvenile crime was on the rise, and Willie Boskett, a young boy who grew up in Harlem, he had committed a string of crimes, including murders on the New York City subway. This piece appeared in the New York Daily News. It's a famous incident because Governor Carey was actually on a press plane to a campaign event in Western New York. He had the New York Daily News with him. He read this article, he got off the plane, and he announced draconian changes that he was going to be asking in juvenile justice law, which in fact were implemented. And many, many children, of course, this is the story of America in the 1980s and 90s, many children under the age of 18 went to prison as a result of changes that were made in New York, largely as in some measure because of this very article. I think you're probably all familiar with the Central Park jogger case, in which 5 black and brown boys were convicted in the court of public opinion for raping a woman in Central Park. They were described as a wolf pack. In fact, it really has to be said, the wolf pack was the media. In the 1990s, this is in Denver. There was a newspaper war in Denver in the summer of 1993, and it was decreed to be the Summer of Violence. This was the banner that ran across both of the 2 competing newspapers, the Rocky Mountain News and Denver Post. They competed to tell more lurid stories of crime. The television stations joined in. This was the Summer of Violence in Denver. There were actually pretty much about 7 major shootings in Denver that summer. It was not higher than other summers. Juvenile crime was already beginning to fall in America at that time. But again, after that summer, the governor convened a special session of the state legislature. They rewrote the juvenile justice laws, and there's still people in prison today in Colorado because of the changes in those laws who went there as children. Famously, the coming of the super predators, 1995. This is a Princeton academic who has a theory that looking at population trends and crime trends, that we're going to have this wave of juvenile criminals who are going to overtake American cities. The crime rate is going to go higher, higher, higher. In 1995, of course, the juvenile crime is already beginning to fall. It really doesn't stop the media from picking up this term. I have to say here, though, that it's really the so-called elite media who are to blame. This is not, I've looked at transcripts of television news at the time, this is not where you're really seeing it. You're really seeing it on op-ed pages. You're seeing in the pages of my estimable former employer, Newsweek magazine, which liked to be a magazine of ideas. So bad ideas can come out of the academy as well as the police can't be blamed for this one. This was not a term that really originated there. But super predator was a word that was used by the media throughout the 1990s, even as juvenile crime was going down. So there's been some kind of reckoning of this. You know, the LA Times, in the analysis I did of super predators, the LA Times was the newspaper that used that word the most of every major newspaper in America. They have recognized this. They have done a real internal kind of investigation in mea culpa, the Kansas City Star as well. But I think there's a lot more to do to look back at the history of our profession and get a hold of what we did and the damage that we did. Walter talked quite a bit about sort of crime and perceptions of crime. This is sort of a weird graph that I took from Gallup. The crime rate and people's perception of whether there's more crime or less shouldn't really be put on the same graph because they're actually measuring very different things. But the point is just that that blue line goes down, that's crime, while the red line goes up, and that's people's belief about how much crime there is. So the correlation between the actual crime rate and the public perception of crime can really be very, very different. Just to take us into the modern age for a minute, I think we have to also look at how the cable news has covered crime. This is a little graph showing mentions of issues of crime on CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC. And this graph, you may have seen it on Twitter, made the rounds. This is just in this fall, 2022. Of course, mentions of violent crime on Fox News peaking dramatically up through the election season, and then sank like a stone immediately following the election. Obviously not because crime was going up, and then suddenly down, but because of political factors driving that narrative. So again, this is just one more graph showing the slanted lines are media mentions of shootings, and then the actual number of shootings are in red. So not exactly correlated to reality. You may not have run across a media critic by the name of Alec Karakatsanis. He's an advocate, a criminal justice advocate with a very sharp tongue for the media. One of the points that he makes is that crime is visible on the street and reported by police in a certain way that leads us to cover it. But that is actually a small subsection of crime. For example, we really rarely cover white-collar crime, do we? When we think we're sitting here talking about crime in America, but we're looking at a very small portion of crime in America. So this is a video also that went viral. Can I play this, Dan?
Yep, just advance.
Really? This is a video of a guy stealing from Walgreens. You may have seen it. It's about 20 seconds of this guy filling a plastic garbage bag and bicycling out the door with a load of stolen stuff. It really made the rounds, again, on social media. The organization Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, FAIR, did an analysis showing that in the 28 days after this video was taken by a TV news reporter up in San Francisco, there were 309 mentions of the incident in major media. So that's a lot, right? That's like 10 times a day people were writing and talking about it. In the 9 months after Walgreens, this company was forced to pay a $4.5 million settlement to its own employees for wage theft. So hours worked that had been reduced and rounded down, time that people spent crossing through security they were not paid for. A $4.5 million judgment against this company received in 9 months not one mention in the media. So again, our perception of what is crime, was it a crime to steal wages from people who worked at Walgreens? Or was it a crime for one guy to ride out on a bike with a garbage can full of stuff? It was, but I think recently, even a Walgreens executive said recently, maybe we cried too much last year about retail theft. Maybe that one got a little bit overblown. So I don't know exactly what you all will be spending the next couple of days doing and thinking about, but one thing that you might consider at your news organizations is actually drafting some kind of policy about how you're going to cover crime. And you may have them already, I don't know. If you have them, they might be worth looking at one more time. The Pointer in Florida, which does a lot of media trainings on this, has really encouraged people newsrooms to develop policies. And I thought some of them were pretty interesting. In Houston, our goal is to help people better understand the community around them and give them information they can use to keep their families safe. Okay, this is a little bit anodyne. I'm not too sure how much it says. Fair, responsible, and comprehensive information, considering the rights of victims and the accused before airing stories, and seeking input from communities affected by crime. I think there, again, it's an attempt to kind of balance the police said side of the narrative. And they've also talked in theirs about, when are we covering crime? If it's something that impacts only the victim and the accused, then it's none to little coverage, like a convenience store robbery. If the impact to the community is immediate, then it's a minimal level, and then if it's significant or less. In other words, a kind of sliding scale of how much time and how much effort to put into what kind of crime story. If you're interested in these, I can send them to you separately. I thought it was interesting that Dayton Daily News had like really specific, financial crimes of $10,000 or more. I mean, they are actually pretty granular in what they're going to do and what they're not going to do. These are just some others from the New Jersey Advance and the Pioneer Press. And I was interested to see public service journalism as referenced. The Star Tribune in Minneapolis. Obviously, I think George Floyd being killed in that city had really prompted a lot of soul searching there. And they're even talking about causal factors of crime, socioeconomic status, systemic racism. Those are big and unusual words, I think, for a media organization to really to be using when they talk and think about crime. I think the question of mugshots is one that has been debated by many news organizations. You all may have policies on that. When is it really advisable to use the mugshot of a suspect, somebody in particular who has not been tried or convicted? These are, of course, images that can live forever on the internet. You may know the Boston Globe instituted a whole procedure by which people could apply to have their mugshot removed from the Boston Globe and from the internet because it can really affect people's ability to get jobs. Often they're wrongfully convicted, or they're not convicted at all, or they're convicted for honestly very minor crimes that still, kind of affect their jobs. We talked a lot about, police said, but of course the criminal justice system involves so much more. And I think one of the things that some newsrooms are really looking at is this a story that we're really going to follow to its conclusion? Are we only going to report the crime, or are we going to keep going through the arraignment, through an investigation, through the trial, and even what happens to the victims and the family members of the perpetrator, or the person who's convicted? It's a very, very, very long tail that comes after that sometimes extremely quick moment of a crime. How much are you willing to devote yourself to covering the downstream effects of a single crime? We struggle with this all the time at the Marshall Project. It's unbelievably hard to cover courts. First of all, it's mind-crushingly boring. I mean, it takes place, it elapses over a long period of time. There's no visual. Sometimes you get the camera in the courtroom, sometimes you don't. You use illustrations, whatever. The other thing is that the criminal justice system is almost intentionally visually boring. It's as though part of your sentence in prison is that you be sentenced to a place with absolutely no visual interest of any kind. We struggle with it. How do we art stories at the Marshall Project over and over again? How do you make a prison look different or in any way interesting or compelling? It's very hard. So, courts are famously not transparent. Everybody in all of our cities, including us, vote for, well, not every state, but most of us are voting for judges. Do you have any idea when you go in, you pull that little curtain or whatever and cast your vote, do you ever know who you're voting for? I mean, honestly, I work for the Marshall Project, but I often don't. I have to say I'm sometimes texting my ex-husband and asking him if he has any advice. That's pretty shameful. How can we really give citizenry tools that they can use to actually participate in, put some democratic pressure on the criminal justice system? This is really hard to do. It's hard for us, and I'm sure it's even harder for TV. So there are a few resources available. I do want to mention the Marshall Project's cluster of stories called the Language Project. So we talk to people who've been incarcerated, people who are currently incarcerated, people who've been corrections officers, language experts. They all wrote for this package about words. What words do we use to describe people who are inside prison? And one of the things that we discovered is that to people on the inside, the use of certain terms really lands on the ear like the N-word. That, for example, the word inmate, it varies from state to state, I have to say. A slur word in New York might not be the same slur word in Alabama, but there definitely are dehumanizing words that corrections officers are deliberately using. In New York, it's hey inmate. What they're saying is, hey piece of human trash. So, journalism is a discipline of clarity. Our number one responsibility is to be clear so that our readers know what we're talking about. And the criminal justice space is full of advocates who want to tell you what language to use. We're under pressure all the time to talk about people coming out of prison as returning citizens. Well, you know what? I'm not going to do that because most people have no idea what that means. Plus, some of them might not be citizens. It's not even accurate. So I'm not saying that you want to use dense language that your audience is going to click away from, but we should be aware how the language that we use lands on the ears of the people whom it's describing. We've done a lot of trainings on this for different newsrooms. It's kind of fashionable to say that everybody should use data. And bless Walter for actually bringing really excellent data to the table and to the conversation. Data is very tricky. It really can be displayed and conveyed in different ways. And as Walter said, a 1-year spike in data can very much be overblown. You know, our data editor is always saying, Carroll, we have no idea. What happened in crime last year? We have no idea. So in fact, we literally have no idea, by the way. So this is a story that the Marshall Project did about how few police departments actually reported their crime numbers to the FBI. As you can see, you know, nearly 40% of law enforcement agencies didn't pass their numbers over to the national level. We literally are not sure what happened in crime in 2021. So, but I mention this story because we built a national database showing which police had reported their numbers to the FBI and who had not. And we worked with different television stations, or a lot of TV stations used this, to go to their local police departments and say, according to this, you did not report your data to the FBI, why not? And that was actually a pretty interesting story. So I think there are, in addition to the Marshall Project, there are other resources that are there to work with you on data. Stanford has a local media project that would be thrilled to work with TV stations. As I say, people in the criminal justice space, especially the data nerds, would be overjoyed to hear from a local television station that they would be very interested in getting some data expertise and help on a story. So there are some helping hands out there. You know, finally, I just want to say, it's a highly, highly contested and politicized field, and you know that. First of all, every court case is somebody standing up and saying this happened, and somebody else standing up and saying, no, it's not that, it's something else. Like, it's really hard to thread your way through this. It's really hard to cultivate sources within the police while also maintaining objectivity about them. It's a very powerful institution. Walter talked about some of the budgets going to the police. A lot of that budget, I was just hearing the LAPD has 25 full-time staff in its Public Information Bureau or whatever it's called. The LA County Sheriff's Department has 42. You know, they're all taking video. They have pretty sophisticated PR operations who are there to affect what you do, tell you how to do it, and try to get you to do it their way. It is difficult to withstand that pressure. But again, I think I admire you for being here for this conference. I hope that you derive a lot out of it, and if there's anything that I can do from what the Marshall Project knows about covering criminal justice, we are also happy to help. We've had a lot of really productive partnerships with local television that have had a lot of impact in their communities. So we're also ready to be a partner to all of you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you both so much. I know we are all ready to enjoy some outside warm weather, but part of the goal while you're here is to ask those questions. And while we have these two wonderful folks up here, we wanted to give you just a little bit of time to do so. So we're going to do maybe 10 minutes of Q&A. We will have a couple mic runners ready to make sure everybody can hear your question. But if you have a question for Carroll or Walter, oh, Jeff right there has the mic. Go ahead and raise your hand. He'll run it around to you, and we'll get going here.
Hi, Cheryl Worsley, KSL, Salt Lake City, Utah. Question for you, Walter. The spike in homicides from 2019 to 2020, do we know how much of that spike is domestic violence? I'm asking the question out of, I have no basis of knowledge, but I'm wondering if that spiked at all.
I don't want to give any wrong information. So I'm going to go off the top of my head from my recollection is that yes, there was a increase in domestic violence or partner violence in 2020. As a proportion of all homicides, I can't tell you offhand. So I don't know the size of effect that it had.
Jam Sardar from Lansing, Michigan. I guess for both of you, what are your thoughts on, obviously we're television folks, we're a visual medium. Your thoughts on, I guess, the proliferation of not only cell phone cameras and cell phone video, but, home security system and, cop vest cams and everything when it comes to the way we cover crimes on the news and how that helps shapes people's perception of what happens, and your thoughts on how that's changed over time, and if you have any thoughts about how that we should handle it going forward.
Just to build a little bit on what Carroll said a couple of minutes ago about how police departments with their PIOs and their large, apparatuses, Chicago PD had a pretty large one. There was a relatively high-profile officer-involved shooting which happened on a sidewalk in the South Side on a Saturday where officers on foot approached the person, and he then produced a firearm. And it turned into an officer-involved shooting, and the police department released body-worn camera footage on that within a couple of days, and they thought they were in a strong position. I think one could make a critique that they used slow motion to slow the footage down. They used some graphic markers on the video to focus the viewer on a particular thing that they wanted the viewer to focus on. And then the Invisible Institute from Chicago did an analysis and was highly critical. They thought that their argument was that the department tried to manipulate what was in the coverage, which they put out. I want to use that as an example of, I think, any time footage is put up by anybody requires a degree of skepticism and critical analysis, because somebody's trying to tell a story just like you're trying to tell a story, but are they trying to tell an objective story is the question.
Yeah, I think cell phone video is the single biggest driver for the change in Americans' perception of police, in the last 20 years. It has absolutely enabled a challenge to police narratives where a challenge was previously not possible. It's been absolutely revolutionizing. That doesn't mean that cell phone video always tells you exactly the truth. You all are professionals and you know how complicated video can be. One thing to keep in mind, and I'm from your part of the world, a little south in Michigan, is how rural crime rates and rural incarceration rates, of course, urban incarceration rates are falling mostly. Rural rates are rising. We did a piece about rural police shootings. The state with the highest rural police shooting rate is Kentucky. And one of the things about trying to divine what happened is that there's nobody there with a cell phone taking a picture of it. There's no challenge to the narratives. And one of the things that our story did was to prompt the governor to ask for body cams for state police because they didn't have them. And that can be a really, really important tool. So I don't know, I would as well like to ask the question of you. How do you think that these alternative forms of video are changing the narrative? How do you use them and how do you approach them?
I think we show a lot more video of a lot more crime because there's more video of it to show. Certainly, we just happen to have 2 police shootings in the last week, and I think police are always quick to release the video when it tends to exonerate them and then hold on to it forever. You were in Chicago. They held on to Laquan McDonald, was that his name?
Yeah, there's a story there, but I can't tell it here.
Yeah. But even police shootings aside, police put out video all the time. Hey, can you help us identify this person who stole something from this place? There are lots of other uses, and if we're here to talk this week about crime and the perception of it, I guess, we're showing a lot more of it because there's a lot more of it to show.
Well, that's really interesting. So in fact, while it challenges the police narrative, it also maybe increases the volume of crime coverage in local news because there's just more video available. Yeah, that is one of the critiques, of course, is that it's just a topic that's over-covered, that something like, I don't know, between 25 and 30% of local news. I don't know if that dovetails with what you experience, but that's academically a number that's thrown about. Between 25 and 30% of what you see on local TV is about crime. Does that feel like a fair number to you?
I guess I would hate to say I haven't seen it myself.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, it does make up I would think a decent percentage, yeah.
Hi, Jesse Garcia with CBS 58 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I just wanted to piggyback off of your comment because I think it's really, really tricky for newsrooms right now to make decisions. I'm going to give you just a quick story. A couple of weeks ago, we had 2 teenagers shot to death in a car in a parking lot in an apartment building. And a woman called us about a week later and said, I have video of the whole incident. I'll sell it to you for $500. My assistant news director and an EP went and met her on a weekend to go take a look at this video. We decided to pass on it. Number one, it's a very tricky slope of are we paying for ring cam video and that kind of thing. But it was extremely graphic. And our bottom line was we didn't feel that it added to the storytelling. In fact, as we kept talking to each other about, other than clickbait, what is this video actually doing to advance the story? That's a hard decision to make, though, because in our minds we're thinking maybe our competitors are going to have this video and they might get tens of thousands of views. But we had to stay really true to our convictions that it was not advancing the story in any way. And in fact, if this were your own loved one, would you want that video to be out there? Even if we blurred certain parts of it and that kind of thing. I honestly thought that our competitors may have it, and I was really pleased that nobody paid for this and put this out there. But in newsrooms all the time, it is really tricky with the amount of ring cam video and things that are out there. And we all know that we're telling our reporters, go door knock and see if there's any ring cam video on certain things. But we have to make these decisions every day. And I'm not here with any answers. I'm here trying to figure it out like everybody else. But I just wanted to give that one example that popped in my head when you brought up your topic. Thank you.
Hi, Allison McGinley. I'm WKMG in Orlando. State-specific question, so I don't know how much help I'll be to some of you in the room, but Marsy's Law. It's a law that was enacted in the state of Florida. Obviously, we talk about victims, and you talk about protecting the rights of victims, and that is exactly what that law is designed to do, to prevent the release of the names of victims. The state has gone, though, so far as to prevent the names of individuals who are in car crashes, but they've also gone so far as to prevent the names of law enforcement officers who are involved in the shootings. I think I know what your answer to that is, but I don't. And so I would love to hear both of your perspectives on that law, in what it was intended to do, and then that law and how it's actually being utilized.
You want to talk about Marsy's Law?
I'll talk about to the extent of law enforcement officers. I think when I began my work, when I shifted from being a public defender into police oversight, I remember the shock I felt the first time I read an OIS investigation book. I think it was a pretty borderline shooting too. But the default by the law enforcement agency, regardless of the circumstances, is to always write the officer as the victim, right? Because the legal standard is that the officer should only have used fatal force if he has to defend the life of himself or somebody else. So default, always, 100%, the officer is the victim. And if you begin from that mindset, then you can easily slide into, well, they're the victim in the report, so Marsy's Law applies, and that, of course, that evades transparency. And I think there's one thing we learned from Officer Derek Chauvin, is that the Minneapolis police officer, is that he had a history. He had a history of engaging in similar types of brutal behavior like he did towards George Floyd. So transparency of an officer on the issues of decertification of wandering officers, I mean, that study of wandering officers was set in Florida, is a serious issue. How can we know if an officer should not be an officer if we don't even know what his or her name is? So a legislator, thinking through it from a state policy perspective, a legislator could easily make that fix if they had that desire.
Yeah, I think it also comes in the context of just increasing lack of transparency. There are all kinds of things that are going behind walls, behind paywalls. There's court data you can't get anymore. You know, this is a very dangerous trend in many ways in the country. And I think it's really important that media organizations kind of band together to fight it, and that industry associations, I don't know if the NPF does this, but God love the sort of journalism organizations that fight that fight, because if we don't fight it collectively, we're going to lose.
If I could add, I think one of the more risky for transparency trends that is starting to occur, you see it in very large jurisdictions and wealthier police departments, is the shift to digital radios, so that you reporters have no access anymore to what is being said over the radio broadcast and dispatch. And that is a serious threat to transparency.
Yeah. Yeah.
Great, thank you both so much.
Thank you.